This podcast is brought to you by North Carolina's electric cooperatives.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
No bunny has more balanced debate for you than NC Spin, so welcome to this Easter edition of our program. We begin our discussion with Duke Energy's proposed rate increases and spending. We get an update on some of the state's interesting court cases and then discuss the May primary elections. And of course, as always, we're going to ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. So let's introduce this week's panel, all dressed up and ready for the Easter parade. They include Bob Orr, former Supreme Court Justice, Becki Gray with the John Locke Foundation, Chris Fitzsimom, columnist and author, and Howard Lee, former state senator and former chair of the State Board of Education. We begin our uninterrupted debate after these brief messages from our underwriters.
From treating the newest member of your family to helping a loved one make end-of-life decisions, your family physician is with you every step, for every stage of life, for every member of your family. Despite a healthcare landscape fraught with potential landmines, family physicians across North Carolina are providing you a lifetime of committed, dependable medical care. Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisor for life.
Agriculture. It's North Carolina's #1 economic driver. It puts people to work. It powers our economy. And as agriculture grows, so does our quality of life. North Carolina Farm Bureau is proud to support agriculture and our farmers because agriculture connects us all.
None of us likes to see our power bills increase, but that's the direction they're headed. Duke Energy, the second largest producer of electricity in the country, is almost certainly going to be raising its rates. These rate increases have to be approved by the state utility commissions, 7 members appointed by the governor and confirmed by the legislature. Now, the process is the utility company proposes a rate increase. It's reviewed by the public staff, a group of consumer watchdogs who comment on the increase, and the case goes to a panel of commissioners. As often as not, the amount of the increase is negotiated downward from what was originally proposed. Making matters even more complicated is the fact that it's hard to distinguish who's making this request. We've got Duke Energy Progress, which is the old CP&L territory, and Duke Energy Carolinas, the original Duke footprint before Duke bought out Progress Energy. Becki Gray, the merged company's been operating now for several years, and while there may have been some legitimate reasons for keeping them separate before, why wouldn't it make sense, particularly to consumers, if there was just one Duke Energy in North Carolina?
Well, it makes perfect sense. And Tom, I've been told that the reason why this has continued like this is when the merger took place, there were different rates that were charged to the different customer bases. And so until those rates intersect and there can be a movement of really merging the two rate for the ratepayers, this is going to continue. But you're right. The complication, the confusion.
This has been several years. This has been going on.
Yes, and it's hard for those of us as ratepayers. And if you try to pay attention to what's going on at the Utilities Commission, the different arguments that are made, the different rates, you have to stop and think, okay, which group am I in? And from just a ratepayer transparency, good government aspect, I would really encourage Duke Energy to go ahead and pull these together so we know what's going on.
Let's talk about some of the issues that are involved in this. Bob, I guess the first one is the coal ash cleanup.
Right.
That's the one that everybody has been talking about these many months. The big question was, should the customers be paying for that cleanup or should it be the shareholders? The Utilities Commission ultimately ruled that the customers are going to pay most of the remediation cost. However, they won't be paid until they've actually been incurred. Was this the right decision to make?
From my perspective, no. As I understand it, ultimately the consumers will pick up about 90% of the cost, and the shareholders will pick up the other 10%. And this was substantially different from what the public staff had advocated for. I think they looked at more of a 50-50 split, spread out over a much longer period of time. But candidly, it seems very unfair to the consuming public to have to pick up the lion's share of that cost.
Well, let's talk about that for a second, Howard, because the truth of the matter is that the consuming public, customers, me and you, we benefited from having lower utility rates all through the years because of the fact that Duke or Progress was burning coal to generate electricity, which was cheaper. The case can be made that we ought to be paying for a fairly substantial amount of this since we received the benefits. You agree or disagree?
I don't agree completely, but I do partially agree that the consuming public should be paying some of this because of the reasons you just stated. At the same time, to have the consuming public pick up the majority share, I think is unfair. But this is making life also difficult for the Utilities Commission. Having served on that body, I know how difficult it is to get to a point.
Utilities Commission.
Yeah, and it's tough getting to a decision based when you've got all the facts and everything is clean. But I think the consuming public should pick up some, and the shareholders should pick up the other part.
Chris, we're told part of the reason for these rate increases is because of the fact that demand is relatively flat. We are not increasing the demand on electric production that we have had in years past, particularly since a lot of the large users of electricity are now going off grid and are purchasing their electricity elsewhere, particularly conceivably at wholesale rates. My question is, doesn't that put a disproportionate burden on people like you and me as consumers and also small businesses?
Well, it does, but I think this whole discussion, you need to remember that Duke Energy is a regulated monopoly, basically. And so we have a right, we have people who work for us, the public staff, the Utilities Commission appointed by the governor, confirmed by the legislature, who are looking out for our best interests while allowing Duke Energy to operate. We certainly want cheap, affordable, safe power. We want it on. We make a lot of demands of that.
Dependable, mostly.
Right, absolutely. But a couple things. I think Duke Energy continues to make bizarre PR mistakes that make everybody give in. I think the way the merger was handled, the way the board checkup a couple years ago was handled, and now we have a person at Duke Energy telling the board, oh, don't worry about the rate hike. It's only a Big Mac meal every month for people. And meanwhile, we just found out that the CEO, Lynn Good, got a raise to $22 million a year. And you're going to tell me that charging $60 or $100 a person more a year, for a lot of people, that is a lot of money when you're living on the edge.
Let's go back to the Big Mac and the fries and the Coke remark, because candidly, I wrote a column and mentioned it in the column last week. As you can imagine, Duke Energy was on the phone with me fairly quickly, wanting me to get a clarification on that because, and sent me the transcript of the hearing. And that PR exec did not say that it was the cost. It was testimony given by someone else. Now, some people in the media, I wish we had Rick Henderson with us this week, some people in the media corrected that. Most of them didn't, however. Does that show a little bias, Becki, against Duke?
Well, I think to Chris's point, I mean, you know, Duke has had some PR problems lately. I mean, it really started, we were talking earlier about the coal ash situation. I mean, it kind of started with that. A lot of people were critical of their reaction to it. You know, who's going to pay for it, whose fault it was, at what point different decisions were made. So they're recovering from PR problems anyway. I think they could be better on their toes with that.
Bob, one of the groups that has been highly critical of Duke is NC Warren.
Right.
And they're saying that Duke is spending too much money for advertising, public relations, and corporate donations. Duke is countering by saying, you know, they spent $7.8 million in 2016 for advertising.
Right.
Now, a company that generates billions of dollars, how significant is that? Do you think that's a reasonable expense?
Probably so in the greater scheme of things. And I know Duke does try to do a number of conservation grants to groups around the state to, you know, to do a positive environmental component of their business. One thing we haven't talked about, though, I understand, is the deactivation or deciding not to move forward with the nuclear plants, and they've got
pay for that?
Yeah, right. Well, I think there's like $1 billion already invested in that, and so I think I'm sure the experts in the utility fields are looking
well,
at it.
I think they call that sunk cost, don't they, Howard? When they look at this. Yeah. One of the other things that NC1 is bringing up is contributions of $460,000 in North Carolina to political action committees in 2016, and $700 to federal political action committees, and $3 million to the Republican Governors Association. Having served on that board, explain to me why I, as a ratepayer, a customer, should be paying for them to advertise or to give money to the Republican governors or to political action committees.
Well, I've always had questions about whether utilities commission companies should be engaged in using ratepayers' money to pay for lobbying efforts, but I obviously made no great progress there. I do want to say that Duke, in many ways, was a very responsible company.
Very well run.
Very well run, and I've engaged with them on a number of levels, and I know that other than questions here and there, overall, I think they've been
Becki,
done quite well.
One of the basic questions here is we toss around, and this is a very, very complicated issue. There's no question about it. And frankly, everybody around this table has done some studying on it in preparation for this discussion, but it would take considerably more to be able to understand too much more about what we're talking about. The big question that comes up often when we're talking about expenses is what comes out of shareholder pockets and what comes out of customers' pockets. Now, I was interested in reading some of the transcripts. One of the people that was testifying before the Utilities Commission said, you know, this is a farce. It's all coming out of the same pot, because unless the customers are having to pay for it, it doesn't get to go to the shareholder pockets. Is that legitimate?
That's a concern, and that's the problem with a regulated public utility. I mean, I think it just that's the nature of the beast. But getting back to some of the expenditures, I feel like I just have to say, you know, Duke has for decades, I think the entire history of the company, they've been good community partners. They have supported the arts, they've been philanthropic, they have supported environmental issues.
But again, that raises a question. Should they choose how I am giving, essentially, money charitably? That
you were giving as ratepayers?
Yeah.
That's a good question. That's a good question, and one that that I think we as ratepayers should be asking through the public staff, through the Utility Commission, rate increases.
Practice.
These are probably some of the questions that should be addressed during these rate increase hearings at the Utility Commission.
Chris, I want to get back to a point you made a little earlier. Lynn Good's salary. Now, I don't think anybody at this table would disagree with the fact that she has a very big job, a very stressful job. And everything I can find out is that she's pretty darn good at doing it. But $21 million a year? What do you think?
Well, and a big increase. I mean, I don't know many ratepayers that got it, obviously nobody got that dollar increase, but nobody got that percentage increase in a time when people are still, you know, I think a lot of people in eastern North Carolina, for example, are still having trouble making ends meet. I just think that adds to the whole perception that the company leadership is a little bit out of touch, and they need to do a lot better job explaining themselves. Nobody wants Duke not to have a good rate of return for the taxpayers.
Well, they're guaranteed a rate of return.
Right, but I mean, and we want them to be profitable. We want them to do a good job, but I think there's a line where those things we need to take a long hard look at.
I think this speaks to a larger issue, though, and the issue is executive compensation, and I think it has gotten way out of control. For instance, in 1965, the typical CEO earned 20 times more than the typical employee in the company. Today, it's over 211 times as much as the typical employee.
But I think it's important to note, too, and I don't disagree with your point, but I think it's also important to note that in Lynn Good's case and in many executive salaries, their salary is tied to the success of the company. A big part of this raise that she received, I think 90%, is tied to stock options and how the company is doing. So, you know, if you're an executive and you're overseeing these and you have a lot of control over how the company's doing, I think it's reasonable that your salary should be tied to that.
But what's a regulated monopoly? If you get the ratepayers to pay more, the stock price goes up and you make more money because you've succeeded.
And you're guaranteed a 9% return on investment.
But I think it's important just to note that the salary is tied to the success of the company.
Well, unfortunately, we need to move on. We've got to devote a large amount of time in recent months to court cases that impact you and me. And the last few years have seen a big increase in both the numbers and the animosity in these cases. Bob Orr, the redistricting cases. have dominated the agenda and our conversations for many months. But as we get ready to go to the polls on May 8th, we want to ask if all these redistricting battles have been resolved, and can we go ahead with the primary elections?
We can go ahead with the primary elections, but I can assure you nothing has really been resolved in the greater scheme of things. And in fact, trying to keep up with redistricting litigation is like trying to figure out a utility rate increase. You need experts here, there, and everywhere, but I think the ones we need to look forward to coming out of the 2018 cycle is the partisan gerrymandering cases that are before the U.S. Supreme Court.
And the Supreme Court heard arguments on the Maryland case this past week. Howard, you look at the, I was going to say, Chris, I was going to say, you read sort of the reports from the press on this, and it sounded like that Supreme Court was pretty unanimous in saying that highly partisan political gerrymandering is not looked upon with favor by the court. Now, the problem was they can't figure out about a solution, can they? So what are we going to do?
Well, I certainly think if we put our minds to it, we can come up with a better solution. For me, this whole gerrymandering process is like reliving a nightmare from the time I grew up in the state of Georgia to the time when I got gerrymandered out by the Democrats.
Right.
But at any rate,
we called it Jim Crow back then.
Well, yeah, that's right. But I just think we're at a point where we need to find a way to force ourselves to have an independent redistricting commission and take it away from the parties, because these parties are incapable of being equitable and fair.
I think we're ready to vote, and I think all our viewers are ready to vote. The problem is we don't hold the vote, do we, Chris?
Well, what's interesting is that we had the Wisconsin case argued before the U.S. Supreme Court, I think, last fall. And I think a lot of people thought that meant we'd have a June decision about it. But I was just reading, and I don't know if this will happen, that I guess Justice Breyer is trying to convince other members of the court to take all these cases, the three of them, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Maryland, under advisement and come out next year in the next term with a decision. So it might be beyond this term before we have a decision.
We may have a retirement by then.
Right. But what's really interesting about all this is that I think they're going to find, they seem to be agreeing that we have a big problem with extreme partisan gerrymandering. Now the question is, how do you define extreme partisan gerrymandering, and what do you do? And the big, as we've mentioned many times on the show, the worst case would be if they decided that that was unconstitutional but didn't give guidelines to the states about what it actually is, and we'd be through this whole other process
well,
again.
There has to be a test. The lower courts and even the legislatures or whoever's drawing the districts have to be able to apply the Supreme Court's rule on extreme partisan gerrymandering to a set of facts.
But they haven't given us the rule.
Right.
Well, that's right, and that's what they're struggling with.
That's the point. That's the point. When you ask what should the Supreme Court do, where the answers, and whether it's an independent commission, whether it's the partisan bodies in the legislatures in the states, no matter who it is, it's the rules that are important. And one reason why I think these cases have gone on and on and on is because there's so much ambiguity in the rules. What we need from the Supreme Court is the set of rules, and as Bob said, Becki, let's have the measures in place, and let's have the rules in place, and then it doesn't matter that much who draws as long as the rules allow very little wiggle room.
In the meantime, our congressional redistricting is on hold. If you remember, what happened was the congressional districts were challenged. It went to the courts. The Supreme Court ultimately put a stay on the redistricting. They're still waiting for that to be heard, and supposedly they were waiting until after they got this decision out, which, Bob, you say may be this fall?
Well, they just heard the Maryland case.
Yeah.
As Chris said,
They've heard
they did the Wisconsin. North Carolina has
Pennsylvania.
a case. Yeah, but here's the critical thing to me is that Wisconsin is a case involving the Republicans overstepping. Maryland's a case of the Democrats overstepping. So the court has a unique opportunity not to be partisan if they take the cases together and say, okay, here's as good a rule as we can come up with. And it won't be easy, but I think they all understand
Somebody
the
needs
importance.
to make the rules, and isn't that what we expect the U.S. Supreme Court to do?
Give us the black and white
tell
rules.
Tell us what
and
it is, and
Now, there's one other one, Bob, I want to mention before we get off this subject, and that is so far as judicial primaries. There's a court case right now. The legislature was going to do away with judicial primaries this year. That went to court. My understanding is the way that has been sort of resolved is we're going to have primaries, but they're not going to be until June. And what kind of turnout can we possibly expect in June for primaries for judges?
Very little, and of course, we haven't.
Is that what was intended?
Probably. But, you know, the bottom line is I think there's some question whether during the May short session the General Assembly might propose a constitutional amendment to change how we pick judges. So everything's been sort of put off. I mean, all of this is doing the judicial.
They've been talking about that since December. Well, as we discussed earlier, the primaries are going to be taking place in 6 weeks. So far, these elections have been pretty quiet. But we can expect that's going to change. Unlike previous primaries, voters are going to have lots of choices. Democrats have candidates running in all 170 legislative districts, while Republicans have candidates in 169. Even so, there's only going to be 26 contested primary elections for the House, 23 for the Senate. I want to ask Howard, you and I can remember whoever won the primary elections in North Carolina was virtually guaranteed to win the general election. That's not so today. Have we become a truly purple state, or mostly red, or what?
I think we've become a state that is a schizophrenic state because we, like a fish with a broken spine, we plop from one area to the other. No, I think, on a serious note, North Carolina is truly closer to being a purple state. But I'm one of those who believes that we got to get beyond just worrying about two parties.
We got to become colorblind.
We've got to become colorblind,
yeah.
And we also got to become more broadly inclusive of other people who want to participate.
Chris, we've had an awful lot of legislators announce their retirements this year, higher than normal. I mean, we normally have a turnover, particularly in off-year elections, but what's causing that?
Well, I think I don't think it's dramatically higher. It might be a little bit higher. I think that you know, the Republicans took over in 2011. I think a lot of Republicans have served for quite a while now, are ready to do something else. I think that I do think the tone and toxicity of our politics is contributing in some ways. I think there are people who are worried they might lose. And the other thing is, I'm happy to criticize politicians when I don't agree with them, but I do think it's worth, in this current age, it asks a lot of somebody to give up their personal time to try to raise money, to subject themselves to all those attacks, right? For a job that doesn't pay very much. So it is a sacrifice, public service.
Paying for a session that goes on and on and on. So I mean, just being able to plan family time, work time is difficult.
A couple of races that I want to bring attention to before we run out of time. One of them is what I call Rucho 2.0, in which former Senate Finance Chair Bob Rucho in the state Senate is running again, this time in a different district. Becki, why is he running?
I have no idea. I mean, talk about, you know, people retiring. He had retired and now he's
on
coming
the Board
back.
Of Governors, for
on the
Pete's
Board
sake.
of Governors, still very involved. You know, he's been instrumental in some of the really significant transformational reforms in North Carolina. He had to move. It's not his original district that he was in. So he's got to introduce himself to a whole new...
Well, he and A.J. Dowd, both his opponent in the primary.
There's several that don't live in, because of the confusion, they waived the rule that you have to live in a district for a year before you
former Senator Rucho, now candidate Rucho, is going to have to introduce himself to a whole new bunch of candidates.
I want to get over to House District 11 in Cary, Dwayne Hall's district. The organization you were formerly with, NC Policy Watch, put out a scathing attack on Dwayne Hall, saying that he was guilty of, and several women had come forward saying he had sexually harassed them.
Right.
The governor called for him to retire. He says he's not leaving.
Right.
What's your take on all this?
First of all, I don't think it was a scathing attack. It was a news story where people said that Representative Hall engaged in a certain kind of behavior. That's not an attack. That's a story and was reported.
Well, calling for him to resign, isn't that fairly scathing?
The governor called for him to resign. NC Policy Watch didn't call for him to resign. The NC Policy Watch did a news story about allegations made against a representative's personal behavior, which we've seen that happened around the country. That's up to Representative Hall and the voters of his district.
All right. Well, I'd love to continue this conversation on the elections, and you can count on the fact that we will pick it up as the primary season wears on. But in the meantime, I want to go to the part of the show that people talk to me about constantly, and that's where we ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. Becki Gray, I'll start with you.
Tom, I'm going to pick up on the Easter theme for this show. Now, I did a survey of the panelists, and 4 of the 5 panelists this week could immediately identify their favorite Easter candy. We're not alone. Americans spend over $2 billion a year on Easter candy. Half of that sales is in chocolate. 66% people prefer solid bunnies. 76% eat the ears first.
There's no question about that. Bob Orr, tell us something we don't know that's not Easter.
Yeah, I want to talk about something really serious. One of the best books I've read in ages is Ron Chertoff's biography of President U.S. Grant. I would recommend everybody read it.
I'll do it. All right, Howard Lee, tell us something we don't know.
Well, I want to offer a complete useless piece of information. Certainly, I'm glad chocolate is in style. But at any rate, I've been trying to learn a little more about how sleep impacts our lives. And so I've come to the conclusion, based on my reading, that if you sleep, your brain gets cleaned.
Chris, I got about 20 seconds.
Well, a long time ago, I said a former congressman might run for the General Assembly, somebody might drop out. There are rumors now that a lot of the candidates, not a lot, but several in both parties that have filed will not be the candidates in the fall. They're going to be replaced on the ballot, which is interesting.
Wow, that is interesting. So you're going to give us a name?
Not yet.
Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, give your feedback, and read my weekly column, be sure to visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. And join us next weekend when we'll have more balanced debate for the Old North State. Until then, stay informed, happy Easter, and watch out for the spin.
From treating the newest member of your family to helping a loved one make end-of-life decisions, your family physician is with you every step, for every stage of life, for every member of your family. Despite a healthcare landscape fraught with potential landmines, family physicians across North Carolina are providing you a lifetime of committed, dependable medical care. Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisor for life.
Agriculture. It's North Carolina's #1 economic driver. It puts people to work. It powers our economy. And as agriculture grows, so does our quality of life. North Carolina Farm Bureau is proud to support agriculture and our farmers because agriculture connects us all.
North Carolina Channel is made possible by the financial contributions of viewers like you who support the UNC TV network.